national conservation organization in the country and has been protecting and restoring forests since 1875. We have helped plant more than 46 million trees throughout the country and around the world. Our policy work focuses on long-term protection of forests, such as increased funding for firefighting efforts, and we evaluate canopy cover in cities to raise awareness about the benefits of urban forests. We also educate the public through tree planting events, eco-travel adventures, and our award-winning magazine, which I encourage everyone to subscribe to. So I encourage everyone to visit our website to learn more about the National Big Tree Program as well as other Champion Tree programs and how to get involved with American forests. So Paul, back to you.
Thanks. Again, my name is Paul Atkins. I'm with Laser Technology. Just a little bit about us, and I hope this isn't too redundant for some attendees that were on the last couple of weeks here. But, you know, we got to start doing a pretty cool project for NASA, and we built a proximity laser for space docking missions. And we also worked with Bushnell Optics, who we then co-created the very first recreational rangefinder for designed for golfing and hunting. We're still active today in doing and designing all their most popular lines for rangefinders. And then last and certainly not least, you know, we created the very first reflectorless handheld total station, and this was actually designed for the U.S. Forest Service. So this is a device that actually measured, you know, tree heights. It also had a compass that you could add to it and a rotoscope on the top for diameter measurement. So we definitely got started in the professional measurement business, you know, working again with the U.S. Forest Service. Do the next slide. And this is just a quick snapshot of some of our current products. You know, down below you'll see 3 lasers there. That's the True Pulse series, from very low end to very high end in durability and accuracy. And then this is just, again, just some of the functions that you could do with our lasers and equipment, you know, measuring area, diameter. We talked about heights, which is today's focus, the degree, percent of slope of any hillside. You know, we do stem mapping, stream surveying. Vegetation management is really big in the electric utility industry. That does cross over, obviously, in forestry. And then last but not least, we have a volume metrics solution that connects with some software and helps you know, measure the stockpile of log decks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speaker today, which is Bob Levitt. Bob, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Paul. I'll be the presenter today. Just a bit about myself. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Native Tree Society, formerly the Eastern Native Tree Society, and most importantly, I am a member of the American Forest Measuring Guidelines Work Group. I am by education an engineer, and that gives you a little insight into my measuring mania. I'm one of the 3 people who independently developed Sine-based height measuring techniques. I'm a co-author on a number of books, including the Sierra Club Guide to Ancient Forests of the Northeast, and a few other things. But my cohort here, Don Bertolet, he has had a distinguished career with the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service, and is a forester of many years experience, and he and I work together on these guidelines. So if anything goes wrong, unfortunately, we're going to be to blame, I fear. But without further ado, let's get into the nuts and bolts. In this last webinar on height, we will be talking about exactly what we mean by tree height, coming up with a formal definition, and how we measure height by several classes of methods, and then we'll discuss a little bit on measurement error, how we might judge it, and then have a little additional information for anyone who wants to look further. With that in mind, we go to the first slide that's really business, tree height. Well, it's certainly an easy concept when we see a straight tree vertically oriented. So when we see that form, it immediately thinks causes us to think of height as a vertical distance from the top of the tree to the base. And again, that's an easy concept, but it is surprisingly error-prone, and we're going to see why that is momentarily. But let's get a little bit more formal in terms of the definition. So here we have 4 trees that appear to be about the same height. As a matter of fact, if we pass a horizontal plane across the top of each and through the midpoint of the base of each, the vertical distance or separation between those 2 planes measures height. Now, we can say this in several ways. We can talk about the vertical separation from the top to the base, the vertical distance. But notice that these forms, these 4 tree forms, are different. The left and the right are typical-looking trees, but the tops are not centered over their bases. The third tree in the sequence is vertically oriented. It suggests the kind of form that you see in instructions that accompany clinometers often. The second tree is really the third tree, but just leaning. Now, height is that vertical separation between the top and the base, the midpoint of the base to be more specific. It is not lean. So as I show the 4 lines there, they are the same. Those trees have the same height, but certainly they don't have the same trunk length. So tree height is not trunk length. Now, once we absorb that definition, that it's a vertical separation from the highest point in the crown to the midpoint of the base, then we're ready to start to think in terms about how we might measure that vertical distance. And we have several classes of measurements. We call the first one, the simplest, the stick method or stick methods. And those methods, or that class of method, is based upon the principle of similar triangles. Then we have methods that utilize right triangles and use particular functions associated with right triangles, such as the tangent function or the sine function. And that's number 2 and 3 here on the slide. And number 2 is fairly traditional. We actually prefer method number 3, and we'll explain why we prefer the sine-based methods as opposed to the tangent-based methods as we progress. However, if numbers 1, 2, and 3 fail us, then we have some more advanced types of approaches, and one class of methods we call the external baseline methods when everything else fails. Now, we'll start off with the class of stick methods, and we have 3 versions to share with you. Equipment required, very simple. We have a yardstick, or any stick, but preferably a yardstick, and a tape measure. And this is for the general public. We might also add a digital camera, but what basically, how does the stick method work? It's based on the principle of similar triangles. So we see here on the right side of the screen 2 triangles. A small red one with sides A, B, and C, small a, B, and C, and a larger blue one with sides A, B, and C in capital letters. They are the same shape. Well, if they are the same shape, one is simply an expanded or contracted version of the other. How does that help us? Well, let's look at this one. This is another triangle we'll start off with, and in this case, I'm drawing a right triangle. Now, let's say I expand it. So the uppercase version is an expanded version of the red triangle. The blue triangle is a large version of the little red triangle. If they are the same shape, what does that really mean? Well, it means that corresponding angles are equal. Well, if corresponding angles of two triangles are equal, what that then further assures us is that the length of corresponding sides are proportional. And we can use this proportionality attribute to actually compute tree height. Now, you probably are going to guess that tree height would be B in the big triangle, and you would be right. Let's go to one step further and express this proportionality attribute as a mathematical equation. Now, notice here that big B divided by big A gives us a number. It's a ratio of those two sides. If we were to divide little b by little a, we would get a number. If the two triangles are similar, those ratios or quotients are the same. Now, how can we take that information and make use of it? Well, we can algebraically solve the left equation in terms of big B, and that gives us this one, which says basically if we know the length of the big triangle, the side, I should say, the length of A, and we multiply that by little b divided by little a, then we actually get big B. And that is, in effect, how we are going to use similar triangles to measure the height of a tree. Now, when we really get started, we have to hold in our minds something very critical. Are we creating truly similar triangles? Now, on the left-hand side here, we have the small green triangle and its expansion, the big blue triangle. They are similar. And if we set them up in such a way that the green side, the vertical side here, masks the blue side here, and the blue side happens to correspond to the top and the base of a vertically oriented tree, we are in business. But if something goes wrong and our triangles are not similar, then we make an error when we try to apply them. Okay, so what is the first of our three stick methods? Well, we're going to talk about a right triangle, more particularly a 45-degree right triangle. And we're going to try to create it on level ground. So here's our little fellow that's going to do the measuring for us. And so he sets up a 45-degree right triangle. And if it is a 45-degree right triangle, then this side here, the horizontal side, and the vertical side will be equal in length. Now let's think about what that does for us. If we can set this up so that we have, in fact, a 45-degree right triangle, and then we expand it to the full, to cover as much of the tree as we can, so that little b masks big B, then by simply measuring the distance from our eye to the trunk, again as a horizontal distance, we have also measured B, which is the height above eye level. Now, in this case, to get the full height of the tree, we would have to add our eye height above ground and add those two numbers together. And let's think about what that does for us. Well, that gives us a simple way in which all we have to do really is measure one distance, the adjacent side to our eye of this right triangle. Well, how do we actually ensure that we can get a 45-degree right triangle? Well, you can buy right triangles at stores of school supplies and whatnot and use that. It's already the right shape. Or we could take a yardstick, hold our arm out here, and actually have the other end, the free end of the yardstick resting gently against our eye, and simply rotate the yardstick around, keeping our hand at that point in the same spot, rotate the yardstick by 90 degrees, so it is vertical. And if we do that, then because we rotated our arm pretty much as that would be like a radius of a circle, and that would be the radius, then we in fact have a 45-degree right triangle. If we position ourselves at such a spot so that if we take the line that goes from our eye across the top of our yardstick and be at such a distance that it just touches the line, just touches the top of the tree, and remember, this has to be horizontal, this blue line here has to be horizontal, then we will be able to apply the method of similar triangles that it uses a 45-degree right triangle, and we can get then the opposite side of the right triangle, which corresponds to this much of the height of the tree. Now, to reinforce this idea, I say that if little a equals little b, and it's a 45-degree right triangle, then big A will equal big B, and therefore if we know big A, such as, let's say it's 95 feet, then automatically big B is 95 feet, and let's say that the eye of the measure is 5 feet above the ground, so then the total height of the tree would be 100 feet. That's very, very simple. Let's not forget that this works only if the top of this tree is vertically over the end of the baseline. In other words, if that is truly a vertical line. In this case here, how do we ensure that we are holding the yardstick in a vertical position? Well, we could attach a plumb bob to the yardstick so that the plumb bob is hanging vertically, and if we get the yardstick to coincide with the plumb bob, then we're in business. Now, what else can we do? Well, this is, suppose we're on sloping ground so that we can't just add our height. We still can use this method of similar triangles with a 45-degree right triangle, the stick method, but we would have to have some other means of measuring the distance from level on the trunk to the ground. We might do that with a pole, for example, putting the pole up there. There would be other ways of doing it. We could even use another similar triangle, but it wouldn't be exactly the same. At any rate, this is arguably the simplest method that uses similar triangles. Now, that's a little confusing looking. Well, let's deconfuse it. Let's say that we go to our tree here. It's absolutely vertical, and we go from the base up maybe 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, something convenient, and put a marker there so that we know what this distance is from the base up to our point. And let's just use, for the sake of argument, 5 feet. Now, if we take our yardstick and we move back to a point, and by the way, we're holding our yardstick at the bottom, and that will mask maybe or cover, let's say 4 inches of the yardstick. So above our hand, we might have 32 inches remaining of the yardstick. That first inch above our hand, if we move back to a point where it just masks this distance here up to the point we marked on the tree, and we said, for sake of argument, that would be 5 feet. If we just do that, then we can look up with our eye to the top of the tree, and whatever reading we get, in this case I'm showing going all the way to the end of the yardstick, but if whatever reading that is on the yardstick, let's say it's, in this case, 36 inches, and we subtract 4 for the base, we would have 32 inches that masks the whole tree. Each one of those inches is worth whatever we set this distance at, i.e. 5 feet. So we have a 160-foot tree measured that way. Why do we like this method? Well, we didn't have to measure little a, we didn't have to measure little b, we didn't have to measure big A. We can just move back to the point of convenience where we mask this section of the trunk up to our 5 feet or whatever it's going to be, and then read a number off of the yardstick based upon masking the top and multiplying that number of inches from the top of our hand to the top of wherever the line crosses the yardstick, and multiply it by a factor out here, and we've got the height of the tree. Now, again, this has to be held vertically in this distance here, or from the top of the tree to the midpoint of the base has to be vertical. Well, that's a pretty easy method to use. We don't have to worry about being a certain distance away from the tree or anything. However, bear in mind, it's not necessarily that equal to know when you've exactly masked with this 1 inch above our hand, masked the distance that we marked off on the tree. It can look like we've got it, but a small error here can make this method error prone. Well, let's go to the next one. The most general method for measuring tree height using a yardstick and the principal similar triangles is to not put any conditions on the type of triangle that we're using. So here's our little guy. He sets up a triangle. He extends to the full tree all the way from the top to the base. He would have to have measured little b and little a, and I'm sorry, I want to go back to that, and big A. And if he has little b and little a and big A, then he can compute big B. So in this example here, we go back to that equation we derived in the prior slide, multiply the distance from our eye to the midpoint of the base of the tree. Let's say that's 100 feet. We take the height of the ruler above, or yardstick, above our hand, and let's say that's 2.7 feet. And the distance from our eye to the top of our hand, let's say that's 2.4 feet. Run it through the formula, and we get the height of the tree. So that is the way we would use these three methods. Now, let's go and Don, for questions. Don, do you have anything to add to what I've just said before we entertain questions?
Well, I'll just make a general comment, Bob, and it kind of gets away from the trigonometry of it all. I would say it's been my experience that half or so of measuring a tree accurately has to do with spending a little time identifying different parts of the tree, separating it out from all others. Not every tree is going to be open grown like our examples, and that it's good to plan on spending a little time getting to know your tree.
I would agree with that. Are there any questions, Paul?
Bob, right now I don't have any, but just to reiterate how to ask the question of using that chat feature, just take your mouse, roll over that top green bar, hit your chat icon, and you can submit your questions through there. So as of right now, Bob, we don't have any questions, so I would go ahead and move on.
Okay, I either got an A or an F. Okay, moving on, let's take all of the remaining methods are going to be based upon the right triangle. And let's just review for a moment the features of a right triangle. Of course, one angle has to be 90 degrees, and then from where we set one of the interior angles, we'll call that V, in this case at our eye. We call the side, this horizontal side, we'll call that the adjacent side, and the side opposite eye, we'll call it the opposite side, and then the long side is called the hypotenuse. So with those definitions in mind, oh boy, here comes the math. If it is a right triangle, and let's say just for the sake of argument, V is 30 degrees. Any right triangle that has a 30-degree angle interior here, if we were to take the opposite side, H, and divide it by the hypotenuse, L, we would get a number, and that number would be the same for that same size angle regardless of how big the triangle were or was. That we would call the sine function, or the sine of the angle, opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. We can also define another ratio of the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse, and we call that the cosine of the angle. And again, it really doesn't matter if it's the same angle size, that ratio will be the same regardless of the size of the triangle. Thirdly, if we were to divide the opposite side by the adjacent side, opposite over adjacent, some of you will recognize that as a slope calculation. That is the tangent function of that angle. Now, how does this help us in tree measuring? Okay, let's go to this. If we algebraically solve each of those equations on the left for one of the variables, look what we get. Here, h, the opposite side, equals L, the hypotenuse, times the sine of the angle. And we look up the sine in a table, or we have it as a function on a calculator, or whatever. But we are able to compute the opposite side if we know the hypotenuse. Now, if we have a laser rangefinder, you can guess that we might get that hypotenuse side. If we have a tape measure here, we might measure from our eye to, let's say, a trunk of a tree, take the angle with a clinometer, and then we can compute with this formula the height through the tangent method, the sine method, the tangent method. Now, just to illustrate, in terms of, let's say I'm choosing only 30 degrees as a case in point, the sine of a 30-degree angle is 0.5, and that would represent the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse. So if our hypotenuse was 100, it would force our opposite side to be 50 in order to have that ratio. And here, in terms of the cosine of 30 degrees, you see there are different numbers here, but you look those numbers up in a table or through a calculator. Now, we have one other relationship, and who doesn't remember this one? Somewhere back there, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sums of the squares of the other two sides. Where would that come into play? Well, that actually may come into play not measuring height directly, but let's say measuring trunk length of a very straight trunk. Okay, from that we go into the traditional tangent methods. Now here, the equipment required is something to measure angle, that's a clinometer, something to measure distance, that's a tape measure, typically, or it could be a laser, and we would ordinarily have a scientific calculator with trigonometry or trigonometric functions, or we might have a hypsometer, such as a true pulse, that would do all of these. And we recommend, Don in particular has always been a strong advocate of photographing what you are measuring. So a digital camera is really recommended in all of these methods to document what it was you actually measured. Going to that, then let's go back to that right triangle. And remember that in terms of the tangent function, we employ the adjacent side and the angle at our eye. And if we take the tangent of that angle times the length of the adjacent side, we get the opposite side. This is what we're going to use in the methods that we use that use this process are called tangent-based methods. Okay, let's apply it to a tree. Here's our absolutely vertically oriented tree. Top is absolutely over the base, and here's our little guy on basically level ground. Now, what does our little guy want to do? Well, first of all, he measures the distance from his eye into the trunk. That's a level distance. Then he takes his clinometer and he shoots the top. That clinometer has to be one of the type that has degrees, and he gets the angle from eye to top. With that alone, he can then turn and shoot the angle to the base. So he has a common baseline for two right triangles and their angles. Now, with that, he can, of course, compute the entire height of the tree, remembering the tree has to be vertically oriented. So he does it through an equation or a formula, and I have two forms of it. And this may look a little strange to you, but let's go through it. First of all, you would expect that you're going to add this and this. Well, if that's the case, why the minus sign? Well, that's algebra. By convention, or trigonometry, by convention we consider angles below eye level as negative and angles above eye level as positive. Now, if we take the tangent of a negative angle, we get a negative number. If we take the tangent of a positive angle, we get a positive number. So with this in mind, let's look what happens. In our case here, we have, let's say, for the sake of argument, a baseline of 100 feet that's going to serve the purpose for both triangles, the one measuring height above eye level, the one measuring height below eye level. Let's say the angle to the top is 43 degrees and the angle to the bottom is a negative 8 degrees. Now, how would we then substitute those values into the formula, or either one of them? Notice that where we have the tangent of a negative 8, then what we come up with is a negative number. That negative number has to be subtracted instead of added because the negative of a negative is a positive. Well, that seems convoluted, but it allows us to have one formula only, algebraically, one formula that serves the purpose of measuring trees in which the top is above eye level, the base is below eye level, or both the top and the base are above eye level, or for that matter of fact, the top and the base are both below eye level. So it is an algebraic convenience. Now, what could go wrong with the tangent method? It sounds pretty good. Well, in the case of this particular tree here that's vertically oriented, okay, we know what we're doing. What if the tree isn't vertically oriented, but in fact leans? Now let's say that our little guy here is going to shoot in this point right here coming up. The actual baseline turns out to be the same for both trees, as shown here. Okay, so we have the baseline. We then shoot the angle to the top. The angle to the top of the leaning tree is the same as the angle to the top of the straight tree based upon the way I've drawn this. And if that's the case, then the actual height above eye level of the leaning tree is this red line here. Now that would be based upon actually having a baseline that is this distance here, not the whole distance to the tree. But that is, in fact, the height above eye level. The height above eye level of the rear tree is this. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that they're not the same number, but the tangent-based calculation was the same. It can get even worse. Here's a case where we have our little guy shoots to the common point for a baseline, shoots the angle that touches the top of the two leaning trees and the straight tree, and that means that we have three different heights, yet we had the same tangent-based calculation. So what that tells us is that we can't necessarily use a baseline that extends from our eye to the trunk. The real baseline in the tangent method is the distance from our eye to a point vertically beneath the top. So blindly applying the tangent method can lead to these kinds of errors when the top is not vertically over the base. Okay, that's pretty bad, but something else can go wrong. Here's our little guy again. Here's our tree. It's on level ground. He shoots to the trunk, and he shoots his angle. Well, that's what he sees, and that's what he thinks is the top, and there it goes. Well, there's the distance. This is the height that he's actually going to calculate. And obviously, if he adds his full height in there, then it would go all the way up to there, and look how much of an error that he would make, because the yellow line is the real height of the tree. He can mistake a limb thrust out in his direction or the opposite direction as the top of the tree. Now that can happen with any method, but bear in mind he was using a baseline automatically that went to the trunk, and that now we see as a real convenience. So, going back one, however, he didn't have a problem shooting to the base of the tree because the point on the trunk is vertically above the base. So we have a situation where getting the component of height below eye level works fine most of the time, but he can run into real problems with the component of the height above eye level if the baseline is not correct. Now, let's go from there and let's talk about what the tangent method then actually measures. It measures to a projected top or a projected base. So here we are, here is a baseline, here is an angle, and then when we take those tangent-based calculations, we're actually projecting a height to that point right there of intersection between the vertical leg of the right triangle and the hypotenuse. The tangent measures to a projected top. If the top of the tree, the highest point of the tree, is vertically over the end of the baseline, and it is in fact in line with the trunk, the base of the tree, we're fine. Tangent method works just fine, and that's been the shortcut that many people have learned to use. And in the case of trees such as Norway spruce on level ground in a plantation, you can use the tangent method without thinking about errors. It works just fine and it's fast. But what if you have to acknowledge that the top is not necessarily over the base? What kind of adjustments can we make? Well, one thing we can do is we can try to orient ourselves so that our line of sight is at 90 degrees to a vertical plane that runs through the high point of the crown and this point on the trunk. If that point and that point lying in a vertical plane is 90 degrees to the line of sight, then we have created ourselves a right triangle at eye level that goes out to the point on the trunk and goes to the point directly or vertically beneath the top of the tree. If that's the case, then what we can do, unless this distance here is too great, we can actually use the baseline to the trunk, a convenient shot, as a surrogate to the actual baseline. The real baseline in this problem, everyone, is the hypotenuse of this right triangle here. It's the distance from our eye to the point directly beneath the top. But if you do the math, you find out that if you're back 50 to 100 feet, and better 100 feet or even more, and this is, let's say, no more than 10 or 12 feet, the top is horizontally offset from the trunk by no more than that amount, then the error that we make is really quite small, a foot maybe, and we can actually apply the tangent method fairly successfully. Now, if we're too close to the tree, or if this distance is really great, then we start making errors here. The trick, though, is to be able to get yourself oriented at 90 degrees to the vertical plane. For a leaning conifer, a conifer that has a straight trunk, we can pretty well eyeball where we're at about 90 degrees, and there are actually even using a compass ways of getting pretty darn close. But it's very difficult to judge when you're 90 degrees from this vertical plane when you have a broad spreading hardwood. Now, let's say, okay, if that method fails, do we have anything else? Yeah, we do. We actually can do something called cross triangulation of the crown. And what this really requires, I say best done by two people, or I would say almost guaranteed you need two people. So let's say that identify this point, and this, by the way, is looking down. We're in an airplane or something. We're above the tree looking down. And here's the trunk over here where it would be. And here is the point of the top of the tree, the highest point, and its vertical projection down to the ground level. Now, if that's the case, then we need 2 tape measures and a plumb bob. And we're standing here, we see this point, and we send our assistant in the direction of that point there, carrying the tape, and we direct the assistant using the plumb bob to walk beneath that top, and by passing beneath the top and laying the tape on the ground, we have a point somewhere on that tape that would correspond to a point vertically beneath the top. Well, that won't tell us exactly where it is. So we move around maybe 30 degrees, 40, 60 degrees, we go 90 degrees. We shouldn't be much under 30 degrees to a second position. Of course, we have to be able to see the top of the tree here. And with a second tape, we send our measure in the direction of the top, passing under it and laying the tape on the ground. Where those 2 tapes cross is the point vertically beneath the top. Now, if we have identified that point, all we really need to do is go back around to the first position or stay at the second position and measure the distance, horizontal distance, level distance from our eye to the point here. And if we do that, then we can shoot the angle to the top of the tree from that point. We have then the right baseline, we have the angle, and the tangent method works just fine. The problem with this method is going to be, A, it requires the second person to really do it, and you have to be able to see this high point from more than one position. Now, you know, if you start to walk around a tree, different parts of the crown present themselves to you at different locations. Some come into view, some leave your view. You have to have the top that you can see. It has to be visible from your 2 locations. If you can do that, then you can breathe life into the tangent method and get around problems that have plagued this method for a long time. Okay, now, before going on, Don, your time, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, yeah, Bob. Also, my experience out in the field, sometimes it's been as a single technician. Other times it's been part of a crew. I think virtually all measurement, whether it's being done by members of the public for purposes of nomination or by individuals with the state or federal agencies that are certifying these heights, it's generally a good idea to have at least a pair of people go out in the woods if for no other reason than safety. But primarily in case of measuring, it's almost always helpful to have a second person out there.
Good point, Don. Paul, are there any questions?
No, currently don't have any questions, Bob. And just to be mindful of time, we're about 43 minutes into this, so we want to, kind of get it as round up to an hour as possible. So just want to make you aware of that. But yeah, I'll go ahead and move on, Bob.
I'll move on. Now, here we come to the Sine-based method, and this is the one that we prefer. The equipment, laser rangefinder, clinometer, scientific calculator, or hypsometer that does all 3. And again, we recommend the digital camera, and we recommend this method for state certifiers when at all possible. So let's go back to our trigonometry. Here's the right triangle again. This time we're going to focus our attention on the hypotenuse. That's where the laser rangefinder comes in. We can measure the distance directly from our eye to the target. And if we can do that, then we can use the sine function. The length or the hypotenuse distance times the sine of that angle gives us the opposite side. Now, let's apply it to a tree. Here's our little guy out there, and he shoots with his laser rangefinder. Hopefully it's a true pulse, L sub 1, and there it is, direct distance to the top. And then he measures the angle to the top, and having done that, notice he doesn't really interact with the trunk. He can compute the top above eye level, the height above eye level. He then shoots to the base of the tree. He takes the angle, and then he can compute the segment of height below eye level, puts them together, and there he has it. Now, he did not have to interact with the trunk. Going to the actual calculation, here's that sine-based equation, and notice the negative sign again, same principle as with the tangent method. A negative of a negative is a positive. And you can, by the way, you can ignore that and just keep in mind, oh, that the bottom or the base was below eye level, and whatever I come up with, I have to add it to the part above eye level, and keep two formulas in mind that way. Okay, but what happens if you can't actually, with your laser, shoot and hit the base of the tree? Maybe there's a bush in the way. Maybe with your eye you can see glints of where the base is, but you can't get a distance measurement with the laser. So you go ahead and you shoot to the top, get a direct distance from eye to the top, get the angle, and the black triangle shows how you measure height above eye level, no difference there. But in the case of the lower triangle, well, you shoot to some point that you can see on the trunk. It's close to eye level, but it doesn't have to be. Take the angle to that point on the trunk, and from that you can compute the level distance to the trunk, and then with the clinometer, shoot the angle to the base, and that allows you to compute height below eye level using the tangent part method and get the whole thing. So to get the D, the actual baseline, we took the laser-based measurement of B sub 1 and multiplied it by the cosine of A sub 3, the point on the trunk that we hit, and we took the sine method, the hypotenuse of the L sub 1 multiplied it by the sine of A sub 1, got the whole thing. Well, that's pretty straightforward, and that's a very useful technique, but there has to be some downside. What can go wrong with the sine method? Well, we could hit an intervening obstacle instead of the top, or we could misidentify the top. Now, there is
Bob, hey, Bob, let me interrupt you just for a second. We did have a question that come through. I want to make sure we address that. It looks like so here's the question. It looks like the laser is hitting spots that aren't the top of the tree. How can we be sure that the laser hits the top?
Well, good question. I'm right at the point of covering that. So here is our a tree, actual tree in a park in Northampton. And if you look at it, and we're standing there with the laser, most people will probably identify that point right there as the top. Some might think of it as being whatever is there directly vertically above the trunk. Where is the highest point? Okay, I'll tell you. It's there, well off of what it would have looked like. How do we know that? Getting to that point. But my point is that that is actually much farther back in the crown than that point, so it's at a greater distance. Now, what we can do with the sine method is simply shoot all the competing tops. And if we do that, we will eventually find the right one. We also have ways in which we can put some of these lasers on scan mode and come right across that top and take the top that has the longest distance. And this method actually shows you, you're really experimenting, but you can do it fairly quickly. Now, are there any questions on Don? Sorry, Don, do you have any comments to make?
Well, I think probably more than half the time it's taken to measure the height and gather the circumference and the crown spread, more than half the time I found is usually spent walking around the tree trying to get a sense of where these points are. And I think a lot of times we get in too much of a hurry and we try to shortcut it by making decisions too quickly. So in my way of answering the question, I would say spend a fair amount of time making sure which one appears to be the highest. Once you've got familiar with the tree, then employ the methods that Bob's just described where you scan the tops, and that will go a long ways towards identifying which top is the highest one.
Sounds good. Sounds good, Don. Any questions, Paul?
Bob, it doesn't look like any right now, so I'd go ahead and move on.
Hey, here we go. All right, what if you don't have a laser and you can't access the trunk or the base of the tree directly? Well, then you can't use the sine or tangent methods. What can you use? External baseline methods, 2 versions. Equipment required, kilometer, tape measure, and scientific calculator, digital camera, of course, and this is really for advanced users. So what do we do? How do we actually use this method? All right, here's our little guy, and he is going to establish a baseline. Whoops, he went the wrong direction. No, he went the right direction. He's going to actually create an external baseline. This is level, and at the end of each of these points, the end of the baseline, he is going to shoot an angle to the top. Now, this baseline has to be pointed in the direction of the top. So a vertical plane must hold the top and the ends of the baseline. If he does that, then he can compute the height above eye level. And he will do it by a somewhat more complex equation or formula in which he takes the baseline D, multiplies that by the tangent of A sub 1, this lead angle, times the tangent of the back angle. That's a product. Then he takes the difference of the 2 tangents and divides that into the product, and he's got it. Now, here's a quick example of applying numbers to it. We can also do that, by the way, by building this formula into an iPhone app or a smartphone app, and or do it in a spreadsheet. Now, it could be that the ground is level, so our baseline has to be sloped. And if that happens, then our little guy measures the slope of the actual slope distance and the angle, and then he applies the technique to get the angle from the lead position or the forward position to the top and the back. And now get ready, folks. Don't stare at this formula too long. It can cause brain damage. Ouch. There it is. We would typically not expect you to do that in the field. We would build that into some sort of an application. So what you would be doing is taking the measurements and plugging them into a formula. Now you can also use the same method to get the height below eye level. I'm just showing it for simplicity of height above eye level. Questions? Don, you want to add anything? We're down to 4 minutes.
Quick comment. I see this not so much as an expert way of getting really accurate heights, but as a way, as another tool in the toolbox of ways that we can measure tree heights. And in this case, it might be a situation where you can't physically approach the tree as close as you'd like, whether there's a river or an angry bull or a highway that you can't stand in the middle of, and gives you an opportunity to make a determination whether or not that tree is really a contender and bears more time getting permission from the owner or whatever the scenario is.
Good point, good point. In fact, that is what motivated the external baseline method. Now, before dealing with any possible questions, because of time, let me get into the final thing. How do you minimize errors with whatever technique? Well, first of all, you have to know whether your equipment is measuring accurately, so you calibrate it or you come up with factors to compensate. In the Sine method, you have to know what your target is hitting. So you have to spend the time Don was talking about making sure that you have tested targets. And you have to have some idea of how angle and distance errors affect that particular method. Same thing true for the tangent method. In the tangent method, you have to know where the top is relative to the base, and you have to know how tangent-based errors affect the height. And you need to practice, practice, practice. Okay, impact of errors. Just to put a fine point on the discussion, here's the laser-based measurement that's actually too long, and here's a laser-based measurement that's too long, and also there's an angle error in there. So you can see that you will have an interaction or a compounding in some cases. So you have to focus on how you might estimate those kinds of errors. We can do it. Now, I have to say that this, I'm down to a short amount of time. Let's say that we have 49.7 degrees to the top and a hypotenuse distance of 177 feet. Let's say that we have delta, that means change. That means a change or an error of a half a degree, or let's say in distance or foot and a half. Then we actually have ways of estimating their combined impact on height through a formula. I'm not going to spend any time on that formula now. That will be available if you need further information. The same process we can go through with the tangent method. Again, a formula that allows us to estimate the impact on height of errors of either angle, distance, or both. And again, we have that. And if you'll notice, let me go back a second just to put a fine point on this. This is an example in which it's the same right triangle. Hypotenuse distance of 177 feet, the equivalent baseline distance of 100 feet, and our error from half a degree and 1.5 feet for the sine method is 2.143 feet. If we fast forward and look at the tangent method, it actually is magnified, 3.856 feet. It turns out that oftentimes errors in the tangent method have a greater impact than errors in the sine method. Now, questions on error analysis. I will open that up. We've got seconds left.
My quick comment is that this definitely goes into the category of expert use and wouldn't be expected of certainly of the general public in terms of how they view things, and only the most ambitious of certifiers at the state level, but certainly at the national cadre level, this would be anticipated as an essential tool.
Thanks, Don. Absolutely. Good point. Now, I'd like to emphasize in a little bit of overtime that in the fall we will have a handbook. It's going to be 75 pages or thereabouts long that discusses every one of these methods and gives absolutely detailed step-by-step instructions to doing everything. You can also go out to the Native Tree Society and read a lot of posts out there that discuss these things, and then of course you've got the Laser Tech website. With that in mind, I think I am finished. Paul?
Okay, Bob, thanks for that. Doesn't look like you do have any further questions. Oh, I'm sorry, one just popped up here, so let's address that real quick. It says, for those that are experienced climbing trees, is there a time when it's better to directly measure the tree with a tape measure? Or then is this the most accurate method of measuring a tree height?
The answer is basically yes. We often measure tree heights by direct tape drop, and that actually allows us to know whether we're how good we are measuring from the ground. Oftentimes, you know, you need to do that kind of measuring tape drop in the winter when you can see the structure of the crown better. But we work with the Tree Climbers International, and Native Tree Society has people who are arborists and who are climbers. But the tree climbing is actually a very important part of the overall process of confirming trees and evaluating the relative merits of different techniques. It's the gold standard.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions we have as of now. I think we have a couple ending slides, Bob, if you want to advance to those.
Surely.
Okay. Yeah, this is just another announcement. This is our last and final three-part webinar series we did in conjunction with American Forest. And if you did attend all three, you actually have up to 6 chances to win a True Pulse laser rangefinder. That's actually going to have a built-in compass in it as well, so it's a True Pulse 360. And we are going to be announcing that actually probably within a week from now. We'll do an email blast to everybody that did register. And again, we're going to have 2 lasers to give away total, so depending on your attendance on any one of these webcasts, that will just increase your chances to win. I do wanted to conclude with a contact page, if you can advance the next slide there, Bob. Yeah, so here's just some contact information. If you have any questions for Bob directly, there's that bigtrees@americanforest.org, and there's also Don's and Bob's personal address, email address there as well. For more information, of course, about the Big Tree program, you can visit americanforest.org. And then any information about our technology, you can visit lasertech.com. And there certainly is always questions about if this was recorded. It is. And we did do one last week, and we're just about a day away of getting that one updated and available for viewing on either site. So we can either look at lasertech.com's or American Forest site, again, probably within a day or so for last week's recording. These will all be available, again, for viewing probably another week from now of today's recording. So just want to let you know for that. And I think that's it. Again, we don't have any further questions. I did want to thank Cherie with American Forest, and of course our keynote speaker and guest speaker, Bob and Don. Really appreciate you guys' time and expertise in this matter. This is certainly some really good content.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a
appreciate it, Don. Again, thanks everybody. We'll go ahead and conclude and consider this the end of the webcast. So thanks again for attending, and we will reach out to everyone about those recordings very shortly.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Have a good day in the woods.